Hi, everyone. Welcome to the July 2021 DIME webinar. Every time I say this, I have to read the date and the year because it's, you think I would catch on by now, but welcome to today's session. Today we have a very special one brought on by some of our friends here. So we're talking about patient insights from clinical research to product development. And we've got some powerhouse speakers today. The first would be Jen Horonjeff, who is a founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative, DIME Friends and Partners, and then also Dr. Megan Oser, VP of Clinical Innovation at Mahana Therapeutics. And as you know, DIME sessions are always interactive. That's the fun stuff here. So before we jump in too much, let's give a little bit of a pause to do some housekeeping. So what we have here, just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. So you can join the fun later, catch all the questions that were asked, and get some and review the great insight that was shared. But also the fun stuff happens with the live questions that we have here on our sessions. So if you got a great question about the topic for our speakers, you got two ways to do it here. You can raise your hand in the reactions and I will unmute you for you to ask your questions live if you're in a place where you can unmute yourself, or you're also welcome to type your questions into the chat box. Don't be shy. All right, it's enough for me. Let's hear more from our speakers here. So personally thrilled to introduce our speakers here. And since they have a fantastic resume, it's always best to let them self-introduce. So we'll start here with Jen Horonjeff. Can you give an introduction of yourself and of Savvy for the crowd today?
Sure. Thanks so much, Rachel. And thank you to DIME, who is a fabulous partner of Savvy Cooperatives. We appreciate them really championing sort of the concept that we here at Savvy hold so dearly. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Savvy Cooperative is the first and only patient-owned cooperative. We're collectively owned by patients. And what we do is work with companies or innovators like Mahana, and perhaps many of you, to help them connect directly with diverse patients and caregivers across all different conditions, across all different geographies and demographics, et cetera. And we do this for the purpose of making sure that the patient voice is heard. And that could come through either market research, user experience research, getting input into clinical research. Anytime there's an opportunity to talk with patients, which we believe is early and often, we're here to help support those companies and innovators to get those insights really quickly. And I'll give you my little personal background and why I care so deeply about this. I do consider myself a patient first and foremost. I was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis when I was an infant and have a lot of other autoimmune conditions that have kind of developed along the way, had a brain tumor removed. So I've been living that patient life day in and day out. But professionally, prior to starting Savvy, I was a human factors engineer and a human-centered designer. I was also an academic studying patient-centered outcomes in things like clinical trial, outcome measure sets, or treatment guidelines. Was also an advisor to the FDA and really helping to make sure that they think about, the patient perspective. And so that was really the genesis of starting Savvy, was hearing all of my colleagues that wanted to do right by patients. They just didn't have all the intel that my patient communities could offer. And so that was sort of the aha moment, is like, oh, you all need to just talk to each other. And that's what we did. So really excited to be here and to be talking a little bit more about kind of why this matters, and then to specifically be able to showcase the great work that one of our clients, Mahana Therapeutics, has been able to do. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Rachel, to intro our next speaker.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. It's always a thrill hearing you speak, not only for your great content and giving us really great feedback, but because of your extraordinary background, kind of wearing, I would say 2 hats, but I think you wear 14 hats at a time. So thanks for that. All right, Megan, can you please introduce yourself and Mahana for the team today?
Absolutely. I am really pleased to be here and to be joined by Jen, who's just done phenomenal work in this field. So I'll give you a brief bio, brief background about how I came to be here today, and then tell you a little bit about what I'm doing at Mahana. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist by background. I specialize in behavioral medicine and cognitive behavioral therapies and digital health. I come to this topic primarily, from a few different angles and a few different sort of benches. So I've had the privilege of working in this space across both academic medical settings and the digital health industry. I started my career at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital as faculty in the Department of Psychiatry. And then there I directed the CBT and behavioral medicine program. I focused on CBTs and other mindfulness and acceptance-based therapies at the intersection of medical and behavioral health and psychiatric conditions. And I really worked across a number of therapeutic areas, as we are also doing at Mahana. While at Brigham, I incorporated clinical services and research within GI, hepatology, cardiology, infectious disease, and provided a lot of clinical training and also provided clinical care to patients with co-occurring medical and psychiatric conditions. So I joined Mahana about 2.5 years ago, and I wear several hats. As you know, it's an early stage startup where we often are a jack of all trades. So I've been doing all things leading the clinical functions at Mahana. This includes clinical strategy, all the clinical therapeutic development. Mahana is a digital therapeutics company where we develop regulated, clinical validated software programs to address a whole host of chronic health conditions that can be targeted with evidence-based psychological treatments or cognitive and behavioral therapies. We started off in the gastroenterology space, and we have the first clinically validated FDA authorized digital therapeutic program for irritable bowel syndrome, and I'll be talking about that today. And what I hope here is just to learn, for you all to learn a bit more about how I was able to do this at Mahana with the teams that I had at the time during the pandemic, and then just get inspired about different ways to meet patients' needs when providing any kind of digital medicine services. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you both. Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and jump into your presentation now. Very excited. I'm personally excited to hear more, and I'm sure that all of our guests are today too. Take it away.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're super thrilled to talk about this, and we don't want this to be really slide heavy. We're just going to kind of set the stage a little bit, and then we're going to pull the slides down and have an interactive discussion. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat along the way. We'll either address them throughout or we'll come back to them at the end, but really want to have you be able to take some things away from this and learn what you came here to learn about. So the first thing that I think becomes really relevant when we're talking about digital, and then we think about, how are we implementing that into healthcare, is to call out that it's maybe not as simple as people who are technologists coming from other parts of, the tech industry that aren't specific to healthcare. And why does this matter? I think one way I like to frame this for people is that there are just so many different stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem that's very different from typical sort of consumer products. And so, if you think about going and buying a car, you will be the person to go check out and select the car. You'll test drive it. You will be the one to pay for the car. And then you will likely be the person to drive the car. So it's kind of one person that's doing all those different decisions and is ultimately the end user. Well, not so much in healthcare. And I think that that's something to sort of call out here, is that there are lots of different stakeholders, and nobody's, perspective is more important than the others. But the person who prescribes it, the person who pays for it, an insurance company or an employer, the sponsor who designs it, and then this end user, be it the patient or a caregiver, are often all different stakeholders. And so if we only ever do product development where we're checking with just a sponsor or just an insurance company or just a clinician, doesn't give us that whole sort of picture. And we're going to talk about why that matters shortly. But I just want to sort of bring this concept up of just, there are different stakeholders and they all bring different value. So Megan, to sort of start us off, I would love, as a clinician, to think about what you've seen over time, how clinicians are being brought into these different companies and into these different conversations to make sure that that perspective is also looped in, that it's not people just even guessing about sort of the clinical application. So what have you seen in sort of your experiences with different companies in this space?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's rapidly expanding, and there's a lot more where we can be involved, I think. So I think the main takeaway I've had from my experience, and also just talking to colleagues and counterparts at other companies like this, is we're working with teams cross-functionally who come from a whole different lot of backgrounds, right? And they're often not from healthcare or any kind of clinical services, and they're not familiar with clinical or behavioral science. But they know, and they're very, very committed to using their skill sets toward building, clinical and consumer grade digital therapeutic products or services. So the way that I think that we interact with them and the way that we help, of course, is just by educating about all of the healthcare ecosystem, which is gigantic, and sort of the area that we're operating in, and all of the jargon and sort of the nuances of all of this. So, you know, folks like any healthcare provider, clinician, clinical psychologist, they're utilized in these companies in a lot of ways. Sometimes they're just consulted. You know, we're brought in as consultants, which is fantastic for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes we're in-house and hired as leaders of the company, such as myself. So we consult and sort of work on a whole range of the clinical process, anything from clinical trial design, the research design, knowing how to even recruit patients, like who to reach out to and how to find these patients and where and what the ethics are around that, how to do, you know, informed consent, for example, and then designing the services as well, knowing where and what sort of slice of the healthcare ecosystem that, you know, you want to be targeting, and all the nuances around the specific patient population that you're targeting, as well as their journey, right? Like there's a nuanced patient journey depending upon what the condition is that you're addressing, and what type of specialty medical care that they're going through, for example, and where they live, and sort of knowing all of those contextual factors is part of our bread and butter in this space.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And as you can see, these are very, related areas when we talk about how can we engage clinicians and how can we engage those patients and families that are also involved in this, because, we just want people to not guess. Stop guessing. There are people here that have answers, and we really want to be part of that conversation. And that's where I was really seeing in my space, the clinical teams and researchers that I was working directly with in academia, they brought sort of that unique perspective, but it was beautifully complemented by the patient perspective that or oftentimes then me bringing other patients in that you wouldn't know unless you had those lived experiences, things that can be overlooked. And I think that that's what's really interesting about technology. As a startup, we kind of roll with many other startups in different types of, sectors, and their go-to, right, is to create a new tech or a new product or new feature, and then they deploy it to friends or families or things like this. And it's just not the same in healthcare. You can't create an app for people with diabetes and have, your healthy, friends or colleagues try it out and expect to have a product that can actually help serve the population unless you talk to them. And so that's what we're going to talk about more today. So with that, next slide, please. That's really kind of our big takeaway message. You can see, you see my video, it is what lives behind me to kind of subliminally message everybody every day to ask patients, just because, again, they have that unique perspective. And I want to call out here that we need to talk to diverse patients, because if we ask the same people over and over again, we're not going to innovate for everybody. It's going to be for a subset of the population. So it does take time and care to do the work thoughtfully. And that's what we're going to talk about, some, ways of doing that today. And then, of course, give it a little bit of a case study with Mahana about what that could look like, so you can take some ideas back to your own teams, et cetera. So next slide, please. So why do patient insights matter? This is why we're here, right? We want to figure it out. And I think that, so we talked about from the get-go that this is going to be about thinking about it within clinical research and in product development, because there's no shortage of places to actually work with patients and to get their perspective. And so that's what we're going to chat about here. So we're going to ask dear Rachel to please remove the slide so you can see our faces a little bit more clearly as we start to unpack some of these concepts here. So first, Megan, getting your take on some of this around even thinking about, you mentioned, as a clinician, you have a lot of these ideas of, we need to maybe get some input here, we need to get some feedback there. Why did you turn to patients? Why was that sort of another perspective that was going to supplement what you knew as a clinician?
Yeah, it's again, broad question, right? But, I care deeply about the human condition. As a clinical psychologist, it's like in my blood, it's in my bones, so I can't help it. but want to talk to patients. That's what I do. That's what I've been trained to do. But I really view the participants / patients / users, as valuable as I am as a clinical team or the product team or the designers. Like, they are as important to making the product a success, to making your service a success. And, you know, I think that it's important, I think, to bring them in for a whole host of reasons. And you can do that across, you know, early and often, of course, like we say, you know, across a whole range of functions and elements as you're designing it. But I think at the outset, you know, you want to understand the user as a patient, or patient as a person, right? They are a person with a full life. And so the product or service, you know, that you're delivering or building out is a relatively small factor in their life, in their real world. It's one element of what they do. And so by talking to patients, you get to understand the nuances of a whole host of rich and variety and varied sort of lifestyles, right? So it's not just in the urban environments, or when you're at, you know, a center of excellence in an academic medical setting and what kind of access they have. It's talking to, like I said, all walks of life. So you kind of know, you know, what their daily life is like. It leads to new clinical insights. It leads to a richer understanding of their behavioral patterns and how they may relate to or engage with or use your service or product.
Yeah, I think that that's, you know, a great way of sort of like framing. There's so much to unpack there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things to start to kind of tease out, you know, especially as a, you know, clinician yourself who's looking at people's behaviors change over time, is understanding even what are the things that matter to patients. What are the endpoints that they care about? And, you know, especially from a digital medicine standpoint, we really need to be thoughtful about that, because what's the point of measuring things that aren't going to help impact the patient? So, you know, that was an area of my like research when I was in academia, really like patient-centered outcomes. And I want to be very clear to say that patient-centered outcomes are not the same as a patient-reported outcome. Just because a patient reports something does not mean that it matters to them, and vice versa. Just because a patient doesn't report something doesn't mean that it doesn't matter to them. And so really being thoughtful about that. So I'm curious too, in your sort of role, how have you seen that evolve? Because, you know, as a clinician, you're the one that's making that call sometimes. You know, do you see that really kind of being part of the advantage of having patients weigh in on these aspects as well?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole mattering piece is huge, right? So even if you find out there's a discrepancy between what patients are articulating that matters versus what the healthcare system is telling us that matters, or what the research trial endpoint is telling us that matters, that is a gold mine of great information and data to have, right? And there's ways to bridge that and sort of talk through how do you translate that into what matters, or how do you, you know, even offer a research study or a way to do a focus group in a way that will tap into those patients' values, right? And not just kind of use, you know, our jargon and sort of our ways of talking about it. So I also think it just highlights how to build your product, what language to use in a way that does resonate with what matters to the patient. And in fact, like, you know, there are times where patients, you know, may not be in touch with what matters around their health or sort of their optimal medical care, but actually part of the service and part of what we're doing is bringing that to light for them. Like, why would this matter to you? So if it can actually be part of the intervention itself or the treatment program itself. For example, like with patients with depression, often they're apathetic, or they don't really feel in touch with what matters, or don't have an interest in sort of engaging in these things or taking care of their health and medical conditions. So I think that you know, again, I was thinking a little bit about what your example was. I think you were talking to me about it, Jen, around the physical movement, I think, work that you were doing with, I can't remember if it was the diabetes or what the case was, but how, again, it's like what matter, that is such a great example of what matters to a patient. And you got that by talking to that individual person.
Yeah, and I can share that. That was actually not my particular study that I think I was referencing in our conversation, but it was a study that was done that was looking in rheumatoid arthritis, so a very similar area to me. And what this particular study was looking for was, it was, you know, the hypothesis being that with this intervention, that the pain level of a patient would go down as the intervention went on, and that as their pain level went down, their activity level would go up. And so here's what happened, that there was one person in particular that the pain level was going down, but so was their activity level with a tracker that was being used in this particular study. And so the researchers and PI were like, what is happening here? And what they did was they actually called the patient and they said, are you wearing it? Is there anything that's wrong? And what they learned by having this conversation, the participant said, no, I feel great, but I'm an author. And so now that I finally feel well enough, I can sit down and I can write, because that's what I want to do. I don't want to go run out or go run a marathon. That is not the endpoint that matters to me. And so it goes to show that there's nuance to this. And so asking these questions and, to also think about, it might not just be relying on a digital endpoint. We have to have other sort of contextual factors that affect somebody's health and health behaviors, because that's sort of what I don't want to have happen, is that we design something, the patient doesn't use it as we planned, and then we call them non-compliant because we haven't done the work to actually figure out what matters most to the patients. And so that's not fair to them. It's wasting time and money. And so that's sort of like, there is an actual bottom line to doing this kind of work. We do see this in clinical research as well, in developing clinical trial protocols and things like that. People always want to know, like, what is the ROI of getting patients involved? And while it might be a little bit harder to put numbers on, there actually are studies out there that show that you can reduce the time of a trial if you actually do the work up front to get patients' insights before you launch it, because every time you have to do an amendment to a protocol, you're delaying things. So the net present value of when your drug comes to market at year 10 instead of year 13 or whatnot, because you actually did the work up front, does matter. And so that's really something to think about, is that I know that people think that this is just like touchy-feely stuff. But if we go back to what we were talking about before about like the other folks in the tech sectors outside of healthcare, you bet your bottom dollar that they're doing user testing constantly. They're doing this iterative design, these sprints, everything from like, what kind of features do people want? What does the interface look like? We've done a lot of work with other digital therapeutic companies to help them do that on a weekly basis. They're getting patient insights. And that's something that's really important too, to understand, like even looking at colors and themes and graphics and characters. Are you talking about a terminal illness that patients are going to feel a different way about how they're being talked to and the way that information is being conveyed? Or is it something that perhaps they want to have a little bit more levity and gamify it so it can look different, and you really have to know your population? So with that, I think it's time to talk about Mahana. What do you think, Megan?
Sure, let's dive in. Yeah, we're good on time. Good.
Let's do it. All right. So certainly, as you have questions, please put them in. I also welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat and perhaps even say kind of what part of the ecosystem within health innovation you are part of, because we'd love to be able to tailor sort of our discussion and any questions to be most relevant to you as well. So please feel free to share in the chat. All right, so, I will let you sort of steer this, Megan, and to share a little bit about how we worked together between Savvy and Mahana.
Sure, absolutely. So we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so how did Mahana do this? Especially, like I said earlier, is how did we do this last year in 2020 in the midst of a pandemic? So first and foremost, before I go into this slide, it was so important to the company that we made this happen, even with a really small team. We had a team of two, really, my team that ran this and led this. In terms of just how we work with Savvy, before I go into this, is we started out looking at a lot of different vendors for patient recruitment. And the interesting thing is this is a little bit backwards. So we started off with an idea for a mixed methods, pre-post research study on our web-based product, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for IBS. And we needed participants to be able to enroll in that study and or that evaluation. A lot of times, when you're doing kind of typical product development, you'd start with a focus group and then do some UX research and stuff like that. So so we're sort of starting the relationship with Savvy at a different point, but the timeline I think was really, really fast, and it all happened right before the pandemic. So I think we started talking with you all in January. By February, the contract was signed, and we had already had like over 40 patients or something referred over. And the thing that I think I was so impressed with there is just how inclusive we could be in terms of the scope of the patients that we wanted. So, of course, I wanted a diverse patient population, and that really spans urban and rural environments, as well as a geographic representation, and a diverse SES. And so we actually received, I think the makeup of those 45 patients really hit the nail on the head in terms of what we were looking at. I think 30% or so actually were either underinsured or were Medicaid or Medicare. And then the remainder were commercially insured. And then, so we started this study. So we enrolled these patients. We started this study in April, actually, right after the pandemic hit. And there was a moment when we thought, should we do this? How are we going to do this? What do we need to do? What do we need to change in terms of the study? And how do we need to interact with these patients? Part of it was we didn't know how long the pandemic would last, right? So we just moved forward anyway. But I think this is where having psychologists on the team, or clinical experts on the team, really helps. So being a psychologist, I knew that the participants or patients enrolling in this study may be going through a really catastrophic time or huge upheaval. And how did the company and our product teams and content teams and other interviewers want to interact with them? How do we approach this from a very sensitive standpoint? And also provide a lot of flexibility for them in terms of dropout and joining late, joining the study late because, they had to deal with a death in the family. We had healthcare providers that were called in for extra shifts, and they couldn't really kind of keep up with the program. So it's like, how do you accommodate that, maintain flexibility while still getting the data and the experience and the information you need that's meaningful? And so this was a 12-week study, like I said. One of the pieces I think that I want to go into is just the lessons learned about what we had to do during COVID. So, and then I'll talk a little bit more about just the broader product implications of what we learned. So, this happened right before, like I said, and we had to rapidly make changes to adapt our content to actually in the program itself. So we learned that we could actually rapidly make these changes and adapt the content. Part of it was providing caveats, like, look, we know this is an unusual time, like here, we're going to be asking you to do some things. These are sort of behavioral change techniques and cognitive strategies. And these may not work right now, right? Like we're all in a different world, and we don't really know what's happening. And this is when, restrictions were in place. And so we had sort of various suggestions throughout for alternative ways that they could engage in these practices or skills that could be done when you're at home, when you're quarantined at home, right? Because a lot of this was sort of, how do you go out in the world and sort of do exposure sort of techniques, and a lot of that you can do. And so we were very aware of that, going into this. Like, I knew exactly which sessions this was going to show up, so I could quickly go in and say, okay, I would never ask my patient to do this right now. This is not feasible, and it would be insulting to really ask them to do this. It's not possible. And so that was one piece I think that was really important, and we could quickly go in and dive in at the very specific level of recommendations and sort of the practices we were asking the patients, and start to change and just come up with alternatives. And then just engaging these patients virtually, right? So the entire time, everything had to be done remotely and virtually. In terms of the qualitative feedback, here are some quotes here that you can read that were pulled, and these are all, I pulled quotes, from our qualitative research side of this that were just focused on COVID specific things. So you can kind of see like where people were coming in at, in terms of their sort of mental and emotional status, or where they work in healthcare, for example. And I think that in terms of, what we learned from product insights, let's go to the next slide, because this will talk about phase 2. So we took the learnings from the web-based product and with these patients, and then we wanted to inform our mobile app development sort of in phase 2 here. So a couple of things we learned that were very specific to the intervention itself above and beyond the COVID impact was sort of, well, first of all, I'll go into the broader sort of piece of this, is that the likelihood that a patient or a user is going to come in with one medical condition is not the norm. So there's so many comorbidities going on, co-occurring conditions, both medical and mental health conditions, that this was very apparent. They talked about it. They gave us feedback on how different, conditions are sort of working and what else they have to manage. And I think that for companies like ours, understanding that these conditions don't exist in a vacuum, you're never treating just IBS, for example. There's a lot of other stuff going on. So I think that the medical comorbidities or behavioral health comorbidities was a huge learning, for the company. And then I think really specifically was, there was something around the symptom diary sort of expectations. Like we had in session 1, there was a sort of a symptom diary and tracking a whole host of variables, and the patients with IBS coming in have been really primed and have had a lot of experience with just tracking food and diet and what they eat. So they came in with this expectation that this is what this symptom diary was going to be, and that's not what it was. And so we had to learn sort of how to change the language, sort of change the way things are positioned and framed and staged for this particular population, right? For this patient population, because they have a different experience with food tracking typically. And so the piece here that I really wanted to focus on in this slide is how we parlayed, the patients that we worked with Savvy into skills coaching videos for our mobile app. And so this was a creative sort of way that this evolved. Like we didn't know this going into it. So as we were developing the mobile app, we were trying to find out ways, like creatively, that we could bring in the human element here. And we knew that peers and patient peers were invaluable. And so we thought, well, let's do some prototype testing. Let's get some real patients, not actors, that have actually been through our program and get them to provide little like selfie videos, like snippets of how they use the skills coaching. And I also didn't want it to be like overly motivating or Pollyannish or sort of everything's awesome. Like I didn't want it to be sort of a marketing testimonial, because that's not what this was. It's truly like, look, I encountered challenges. This is hard, and here's how I did this, right? Or this worked for me and this didn't work for me. I wanted it to be very, very realistic from a patient experience, going through this. And so you can see here some quotes as well around how this actually landed with some of our patients. And we got these quotes and sort of these qualitative feedback, I think from written feedback, actually. So this was just anonymous, and they didn't have to give us this feedback. These were just responses to surveys. But they did call out that this really resonated with them. And so what we did is we had a skills coaching video for every single session. They're like a minute a piece. And we did all of that remotely and virtually as well. So we had to figure out, how to mail a tripod for their for their phone camera, and how to help with lighting. And, we worked with, a media expert on this as a consultant. And so she was helpful there to coach. And just an editor. And so we did all of this remotely. So we had to mail the tripods to them and then mail them back. We had to work with all the media consent forms for the first time with our legal counsel. So everything, we did this from scratch. And it's really worked out, nicely. I think some of the quotes here that I want to call out is really, it's so nice to see someone else who had my IBS subtype. It's really positive and very real to me. I like that they don't seem like actors. Well, they weren't actors, so that's good. It was nice to see, this program really helped them out at this time. And then here's sort of a neutral comment. So this person said, I prefer to read, so the videos themselves actually didn't find them that engaging. So it was great that they could scroll down and actually read the transcripts. So they still, got some benefit out of this. But if it was just video, they wouldn't have engaged with it. And so I'll stop there, Jen, and we can have some more discussion about this and pull some threads.
Well, I think, again, we're so grateful that you did stop to ask patients. And, one of the things that I kind of take away from this is obviously these are two very different sort of activities, if you will, like engaging patients in clinical research, taking those insights, and then iterating on your product. And I think what's also fascinating is how can we translate this to other aspects of product development and launch? In your case, what was happening when you mailed tripods to patients and they're recording videos, the patients themselves actually became part of the product. That those insights is something that, would it have been the same thing if it was a clinician that was doing the videos and saying like, hey, we know that IBS is like blah, 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 or is it actually feel more engaging because it's from a patient and also not an actor? So I like that that's called out. But the sort of like piece I want to tie together for other people that may not have an application to have patient videos in or things like that is we actually see some of the same techniques though used for more classical marketing, for campaigns that are being put out there, for Facebook ads that have, actual patient testimonials, for things on their website. And I also want to be clear because I have a captive audience. When I talk about including patients, I firmly believe that patients should be fairly compensated for their time and expertise. And I know that this is something that Mahana cares about, that Dime cares about, that the people that are listening in I know care about. But, especially when it comes to marketing, when we work with companies to help them understand what is fair market value, marketing can look different because that has different applications to be sort of selling your product and may have more of an evergreen sort of way of existing in the world in a public facing matter, as opposed to, internal insights, doing like a focus group or something like that. But there's just so many different ways that patients can convey sort of the things that you can't because you don't have the same lived experience. And so I'm curious, sort of, Megan, as you've seen this stuff roll out, and I know that obviously, your product development and launch are in different sort of phases, but, just reflecting on it, how do you see this product sort of stacking up against, I know that it might not be an exact analogs in the space, but just other things that you've seen out there in the ecosystem? Like, are people, and when I say taking advantage, I don't mean in a negative way, but using patient insights as sort of like a value add? Have you seen this happening?
So other companies that are using it in this way? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, in terms of any company that has sort of folks like me as counterparts there. So a lot of the digital therapeutics companies are doing this. Any digital therapeutics, alliance company that's a part of that trade organization is doing this. I think that anyone that is working with UX researchers or designers is doing this because they're trained in human-centered design, for example. I think that there's a lot more though that we can do. So, for example, I think when you have folks from the consumer tech space who are now in this world, they may, like I said, they may just want to do kind of your generic user testing, but you really need to talk to the patients, right? So I think that there still is that, I still see that gap a little bit. I see that, we have another kind of creative way we do this is we actually have patients come in and talk about, their experience for lunch and learns for the company, right? Like training the company, just so that we can ask and sort of navigate that process as well. And I do see, a lot of, the typical thing you see, right, is using like patient quotes on their websites and things like that come from their real users or real patients that they're helping. I think that one bias or one skew that you tend to see is using only the positive quote, like internally, like using only the positive feedback and sort of the positive pieces, and not really focusing on what are the themes of where the struggles are and sort of the challenges, or where is this sort of a rare case, but it matters. Yeah, that might not be the norm, or that might not be what the mainstream patient, but it actually matters, and we need to pay attention to that. And sometimes drawing those connections is quite difficult if you don't really understand the patient population, and again, like the healthcare ecosystem that they're in, and all the contextual factors.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought up that point. I think it's something that we see all the time. And in fact, is why we brought a lot more of the research in-house for us, because we saw that some of our, pharma or digital health clients were glossing over things. And we had to be able to spell it out for them because we knew the importance it had to those patients, but it was cherry picking results to be able to say, oh, they like this, so we're going to go off with that. The other danger that we see all the time is you're just looking for that checkbox, right? We talk about tokenism of, using patients just to say, oh, we did it. We talked to one patient, or, we talked to just only a patient advocate that maybe has a higher health literacy or tech literacy or whatever it might be. And, oh, well, they loved it and they understood it, but you haven't gone to talk to more diverse, participants that would hopefully be the ones using your product as well. And it's oftentimes people are doing this because it's too late in the game. They'll come to us and then get savvy and say, hey, we need people to, review this protocol. And we say, great, so let's do this. And they'll be like, oh, no, we don't want to go that deep into it because we actually don't have time to change it. So like, well, what do we do?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
And
Yep.
Look, I get it. And I try to give people a little bit of grace that we all got to start somewhere. So I just want people to think now, how can you plan a little bit better in advance so that we don't have sort of that seal of approval, so that you can actually co-design these things, because that's when things get really interesting. That's when you make a better product. That's when you have a better clinical trial because you've done the work up front. But people just get I don't know, they think that this stuff is the touchy-feely, and we just have to do better making a sort of business case for it, because I truly believe that there is, and it's been awesome to see more and more companies adopt it. One of the things that we frequently heard too is about the time frame, and Megan, appreciate you calling sort of the swiftness with which we are certainly able to operate. It was actually our clients that asked us for what is now our subscription model, which is a really easy way to get patient sites, because it's just a single subscription, and then whenever you need us, you're just pinging us for interviews or prototype testing or things like that. It's not a whole separate SOW or separate project. So we're helping companies get patient insights on a daily or weekly basis based on whatever pops up for them. And I think that that's been awesome to see people not waiting 6 months before they convene another focus group, especially when we're talking digital. You're working in 2-week sprints, too much changes in even a month. So we really need to stay on top of getting those insights if you want them to matter, if you want to be more proactive and not just have it be a checkbox that once your product is done, hooray.
Yep. One thing, yeah, and one thing I do want to mention, I think that's different, that I think that again, it taps into this, the need to consult with expert stakeholders and other experts in this field. Outside, there's patient experts, right? But then there's the clinical experts. Is so, you can ask a lot of patients, what do you like, or how do you behave, or how do you think you would, engage in this? But until you actually see them go through the product in the observable way, there can be a huge discrepancy. I mean, we know as psychologists, often what you think you do and what you say you do is actually not at all in line with your actual behavior. So, so that's really important. So I think that, one really clear example to me that came up is coming in with my experience, sort of expertise with these patients, is that I came in sort of talking about how do we need to pace this program? There's a progression model to get them to learn according to learning theory and how neurobiology changes, and how do you pace it? They can't sort of binge watch it like a Netflix episode. You know what I mean? We need to sort of gate this. And I think that was really hard for a lot of the team to really get behind. They're like, well, no, we want patients just to be able to go through this as they want to, when they want to. And so we came up with a balance. But if you would have asked patients at the time, they said, no, I'd want my choose my own adventure kind of a thing. But in fact, when they went through it, the pacing lined up exactly, sort of exactly how we wanted it. And they commented on that. At first I thought well, it wouldn't let me, progress to the next session until the next day. And at first I was like, why is that happening? But then I realized, oh, it's slowly built and it's actually better for me. So there's ways that you are helping the patient understand what works for them, right? By bringing in some of these experts to design it, but it needs to be a two-way, it needs to be reciprocal, and of course, a two-way street. But I think that there can be a tendency to just listen to everything, right? You bring patients in and whatever they like and sort of whatever their preferences are, that's what you should build or incorporate. And that's not the case. I mean, it's hard to talk about that, but it's often not the case. And so that's where you need to have that balance.
Absolutely. And I think that that's exactly it. It's balance. And it's what I like to remind people, that it's no one stakeholder perspective is more important than the
Yeah.
next. It's being able to have them all, and then to be able to make informed decisions. And look, you're going to, like, I want to give you all permission. You're going to fail. You're going to get it wrong, but that's cool. You're going to do it better next time. Like, let's use every opportunity to learn, to iterate. And that's how you're going to make the best product, if you actually invest that time and have that level of curiosity. I think that, we know that from the startup world too. Like, people have their tunnel vision. They're like, I know my product best, but like, those are the ones that fail. You need to have some humility that you don't have all the answers. And, we were working with one of our big pharma clients. Obviously, I'm under NDA. I can't specify all of it, but creating, an app to help patients during trials. And there was one part that was super cumbersome for the patients to figure out, like, what is happening. And it was so rewarding, very personally for me, to then listen to hear that pharma company made a huge, significant change, which is actually going to cost them a lot of money. But it's because the patients just really were challenged by part of what they were being asked to do. That is how we're going to do better, is if we actually listen to the patients. And like I say, it's going to cost them a lot of money, but it made the most sense because they're going to be able to enroll and do better in the future. So I think that that's like an amazing way that we can see people are actually taking actionable steps to improve the patient's experience, which, again, the overall standpoint of thinking about a clinical trial, you're going to make it easier on the patient. It's going to be so much better. You're going to get better data, and the whole thing gets so much better. So I do see we have some questions coming in. Please feel free to put more in. I'm going to start with this first one here, which is asking, what is your sense of whether startup investors are asking about or requiring this kind of diverse patient user testing or customer interviews? Do investors recognize the value, or does more education need to be done? Well, I'll take a stab at this first, but certainly welcome your thoughts, Megan, as somebody at a startup as well. The truth is, I believe the answer is yes. We at Savvy, we actually do work with a lot of investors and incubators and accelerators to help their portfolio companies get insights. We also work with investors to help them do diligence on the people that they're looking to invest in, to see if these companies and tools and whatever actually matter to patient populations. Do I think that there is more work to be done? Absolutely. But like, that's hopefully what we can all see, is if we can figure out if patients actually care about this concept. Maybe the product's not quite there, but if there's some level of product market fit, obviously that's what investors want to see. And then you can get insights to sort of iterate on that. So I do see more of a focus in this area, especially as there's like, what is the current number about the money that's being pumped in digital health? Something astronomical. And so I think that we're going to see this more and more, that if people are going to do things right, we need to help support them and get them the right tools that, obviously startups, it's hard, you're strapped for cash, but there are different ways that you can bite this off in little pieces. It doesn't have to be a massive user testing study for everything you do, but something that helps kind of, address those things along the way. But I would be curious, sort of, Megan, your experiences at, digital health startups, and is that something that was ever asked of you all?
Yeah, can you repeat the actual question, like what was actually asked in terms of that? Because I actually cannot find it here in the chat.
Sure.
And so there was a lot in there. Okay. I'm scrolling through the chat, like where is that question?
It says, yeah, what is your sense of whether startup investors are asking about or requiring this kind of diverse patient user testing or customer interviews? Do investors recognize the value, or does more education?
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, I think it really varies depending upon the investors. I think, those that, I mean, luckily with ours, a lot of them came from the patient background, like they were either MDs themselves, in the past, or scientists in this space, so they really do understand. But, I think that, I've heard both sort of pieces around, like, let's get more patients into the site. Like, how can we, sort of get more feedback from patients, but not necessarily the exact methods to use to do that, right? Like a lot of, like, at least the investors that I've worked with across several different companies, like they may not know those exact methods or how to do it, or what is the best practice, or what are the industry standards for doing this, but just please go do it. Like, this is important, do it. So I think it does depend on, on the stakeholder, the investor stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's, a great point, as other people might be thinking of other questions. The methodology does matter. And That's what we work with companies to really help them figure out, like, where are you in your product development? So how would you think about getting patient insights? Are you in the discovery phase? Are you just trying to understand what is the experience like of somebody with IBS or pancreatic cancer or whatever it might be? Like, how can we figure out what is it like to live in that space? And then you start to tease out, like, what are the unmet needs? So that kind of work is typically done through things like ethnography and in-depth interviews, or we run a lot of these sort of online workshops to get a lot of people to be able to weigh in and to feed off of each other. That's another beautiful thing to do, that sometimes, like, people always just want to deploy a survey, and like the amount of time that we spend talking people out of just doing surveys, because number one, most people are not great at writing survey questions. And we have had to take a lot of that back to help review it, because then you're just not asking the right questions or in the right way. I mean, people oftentimes just pose these sort of yes or no questions to patients. That's not how you do user research. These, unless you give sort of open-ended questions to see where the person's, brain goes, it's kind of, again, sort of leading them of like, do you like this product? And that's not helpful. So we really need to uncover that. So I help people try to like understand that sort of that quantitative data, which is of course valuable, but that's a signal. It helps us see like if there's a problem or if something's wrong, like that RA study that I was talking about, where that person wearing the activity tracker, something was off. But then you have to actually have a conversation or ask patients to be able to fill in, well, why is that happening? So a lot of this stuff is very rooted in qualitative work. And so if that's not your background, making sure that you're working with folks, or maybe hiring someone on your team or whoever it might be, that just does have that background, so you can get the most out of your patient insights.
Yeah, I do think that's a really great comment from both of you guys. So thanks for the really great insight. Some of the questions that I often get from teams who want to do this kind of work, but simply just don't know where to start. I got some pragmatic questions, so hopefully we can see if we can help different kinds of folks. So in Dime membership, we have all kinds of folks. We also have a lot of folks who are maybe an N of one kind of a company or a startup, right? Where the idea of getting patient insights is like it's a yes, but here in the research world, we're used to, ends of hundreds or of thousands of folks. So the idea of getting more patients for insight is a yes, but how? Or where can I start? Or, depending on the time of day, what's kind of the limiting factor at your company will be time or funds as well. So I guess the question might be for Jen. For these kinds of really small teams who haven't yet really been able to really embrace patient insights at their company, how do you suggest they start?
It's a great question. I mean, we actually just launched more of like a DIY model, as we're calling it, for these like smaller, startup types that, coming up with like, here's who we're looking for. And then we're just quickly connecting them with patients. And it might be 5 people. It might be, then coming back and doing another 5. So you don't have to think like, my gosh, I have to get this enormous sample, because the rich insights that you get from even just a few participants, as long as there's diversity within those, participants you're looking for, it's a place to start. That's what I said. Look, even the big companies, even our big pharma companies will still use these methods with them. Let's start with 5 people, then let's wait and let's digest that. And then let's go ask a few more and a few more and a few more, as opposed to like asking tons of people, but maybe you didn't even get the questions right. And so you kind of wasted it. So I think it's like the perfect time to just kind of get your feet wet and talk to a few people and then, iterate. I think everybody, especially in the startup world, kind of waits to be like perfect. And even not in the startup world, like, the biggest companies, like think about what is the perfect patient engagement. And spoiler alert, there is none. It's just start somewhere. And so that's what I would say is these smaller companies, like, just starting with a few people, digesting that, and then creating a culture of patient engagement is even better than thinking about, well, I'm going to do this one big project and then check that off my list.
Thanks for that, Jen. And also Megan, with your insight about how your team would talk to, I think 4 to 45 patients, and you said that your internal team helping was maybe about 2 folks. That to me, I think is really, really amazing. So I'm also thinking about how can small teams really sort of get these kinds of success to be able to build in this kind of patient insights into their product development. So if the 2 people, I'm personally questioning the 2 people on your team, were they dedicated 100% only patient insights? hats, or were they kinds of people who wore just all the hats even on their shoulders because there's
One was, yeah, that's a great question. So one was fully dedicated to this, one was not. And then there was me sort of leading the whole thing. So I was of course wearing many hats, but no, yeah, that was it. And I think that, the one of the reasons why we could do this is I've run these studies before, right? So I know how to set up the infrastructure. I knew how to get an IRB. I knew kind of how to, but I hadn't worked with vendors like Savvy before. So that was new. But I think that setting everything up to like have patient enrollment, be able to do it, in a somewhat structured way, even though it was COVID. I knew that going in, but we only interviewed. So our qualitative research expert in-house, that's the one that was actually not full-time dedicated to this, but she was able to interview. That's the most laborious time and effort is actually doing patient interviews and scheduling. She interviewed, I think, 15 to 20 of those. So we didn't speak to all 40, 45, but they were also providing qualitative input just through survey responses after the quantitative study too, or sort of while they were going through it. So we got it from a couple, like I efficiently got it from lots of different angles. And then sort of, a lot of them we also passed off to the product team as well later on, so that they could do, the UX team and the design team could actually interview them and do some think aloud techniques and other things like that. So we were able to, I think, like I said, in a very efficient way, use even a small group of patients across many different facets of the company and sort of meet those needs. So kind of getting your biggest bang for your buck with like even a small patient, like say it was those 15 patients. Like how can the entire company and Mahana use these and not just the clinical research or clinical development team? And so we were able to do that. And I think a lot of it just came from my experience. I do want to piggyback a little bit off of what Jen was saying, like, even if if you're a startup and you only have one or two, there's two co-founders or something like that, and you don't even know what kind of patients you need, but you need something. Like I'm an expert in this area, even by talking to Jen, for example, or other vendors, like there's a dialogue and they help shape what you need. Because they have all this experience and expertise, like they will offer ideas like, well, if we have 5, would you want, how many, like what gender, sort of distribution, or what geographic, what's most important? Do you want tech savvy folks or those with low tech savviness? What kind of, and they'll help sort of shape it. You don't have to come in knowing exactly the type of patients that you need, just that you need to interact with them as soon as possible. And they also provide like a firewall for it too. So in terms of compliance and regulatory guidelines as well, which brings in another area that we had to operate under.
Fantastic. Thank you both for answering those questions. I think really useful information for every single person on the line. All right, we're coming to the close here. Wow, that was a quick hour. Closing words here. Jen, burning final thoughts, and then we'll go to Megan.
I mean, my closing thoughts are always the same. I'm a broken record, just like asking patients and starting somewhere and just having that curiosity. And like I said, that humility to say, I don't know all the things and I might not get it right, but thank you, Megan, for calling out that there are those of us that live and breathe this every day. And we truly want you to do this work and be better and make better products and services for patients. And I think, to bring it back, it's a personal sort of selfishness for me. Like I am a patient and I have spent my lifetime with products or services that don't actually fit my needs, that are cumbersome, that are actually harder to use, that are making it so I can't maintain my care the way it's supposed to be because I've been thrown all of this stuff that has been designed in a vacuum. And I, exist out in a world that there's so many things that have to be navigated. And so you're actually going to be helping these patients take better care of themselves if they work with you, and they want to. And so we are here and excited for more companies to be thinking about the value of patient insights. So thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jen. Megan, burning thoughts?
Oh, burning thoughts. Well, I think digital medicine, digital therapeutics has, such far-reaching potential to shift care and help, and we don't want that to go awry, right? And so one of the ways that we can really harness like these opportunities and really address gaps in care is to, engage with, sort of the patient experts and the patient's lived experience themselves. I view all of them as experts because they have the lived experience, as well as clinical healthcare experts, right? So this is the way that we will find, the best path forward. And I just want to say, thanks to the Dime Society, right, that you're at the forefront of pulling all of this stuff together. and leading the way. And so I applaud you all for that.
Well, fantastic. Many thanks to Jen and Megan for the excellent insights today. We all learned so much. Thank you for this. And so we're right at the hour, so we'll do some quick closeout here. So our next DIME event is our Journal Club event. So we'll have the Pfizer team talking about the latest publication about age and environmental differences related to healthy adults using wearables, something that I know many of us are working in now. Powerhouse team here from the Pfizer group presenting their publication. And then our next webinar occurs August 2nd. It's actually the first part of a 3-part mini series that we're bringing to the DIME Society membership here in partnership with Transcelerate and the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI. So fantastic groups bringing great information. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar live today, and extraordinarily gigantic thanks to Jen Horenjeff and Megan Oster bringing this fantastic insight to DIME today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Take care.